An old woman is forced to solve a complex calculation, unaware that she was Albert Einstein's wife. When the elderly woman, with gray hair and simple clothes, entered the room filled with the greatest minds in modern physics, no one could have imagined that she, the humble Days, harbored a secret that would bring them all to their knees. She was the wife of the greatest scientist of the century, Albert Einstein. Take your seat and get ready. You won't forget this. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? It was an autumn afternoon in 1955. Golden leaves danced across the campus, while the nation's brightest students settled in to attend Dr. Robert Oppenheimer's lecture, one of the most respected theoretical physicists of the time. The room was dominated by serious-looking young men, all formally dressed, with open notebooks and pens in hand, ready to absorb every word from the illustrious professor. However, in the last row, without fanfare or ceremony, sat an elderly woman. Days had her gray hair tied in a simple bun, wore a modest floral dress, and carried a leather purse worn by time. Her eyes, though, sparkled with an intense curiosity that contrasted with her fragile appearance. The students exchanged confused looks. An elderly lady in an advanced theoretical physics class. Surely she had entered the wrong room. Dr. Oppenheimer had not yet arrived, and the elderly woman's presence began to provoke discreet laughter and whispered comments among the students. Richard Feynman, a young assistant professor who was observing the room while waiting for his superior, noticed the growing commotion. "Gentlemen, is there a problem?" asked Feynman, adjusting his glasses as his gaze traveled over the faces of the students until he found the object of their distraction. "Professor," stood up one of the students, James Walton, son of a senator and known for his arrogance, proportional to his privileged intellect, "I believe we have a lost visitor. This class is advanced theoretical physics, not cooking or gardening." Laughter echoed through the room, while Days remained impassive, only adjusting her simple glasses and opening a small worn notebook. "Perhaps she's looking for the knitting class," added another student, provoking more laughter. Feynman frowned, but before he could intervene, the door opened again, and Dr. Oppenheimer entered, carrying a stack of papers and with a concentrated expression. "Good morning, gentlemen." Oppenheimer began placing his materials on the desk. His gaze swept across the room, pausing briefly on Days's figure, but he made no comment. The class began with a discussion on the implications of quantum theory on gravitational fields. The concepts were complex. Equations rapidly filled the blackboard, and the discussion was vibrant between the young prodigies and the professor. During all this time, Days remained silent, only observing and occasionally making notes in her notebook. Her presence was soon forgotten by most, absorbed as they were in the complexities of physics. After about an hour of theoretical exposition, Oppenheimer proposed a particularly challenging problem, a partial differential equation related to the curvature of space-time under extreme conditions. "Who would like to try to solve this problem on the board?" asked the professor. Several students raised their hands, eager to demonstrate their knowledge. However, it was at this moment that James Walton had a cruel idea. "Professor," he said with a malicious smile, "why don't we invite our special visitor to solve the problem? I'm sure she must have come here for some reason." Silence took over the room as all eyes turned to Days. Oppenheimer seemed momentarily disconcerted, but before he could respond, other students joined the chorus. "Yes, it would be interesting to see a different perspective," said another student, with a condescending tone. "Perhaps she has insights that we, mere students of quantum physics, cannot see," added a third, provoking more laughter. Oppenheimer gave the students a stern look, but the damage had already been done. The atmosphere had become tense and charged with juvenile cruelty masked as academic humor. "Gentlemen, this is a learning institution, not a stage for humiliation," Oppenheimer said firmly. However, to everyone's surprise, Days closed her notebook, rose slowly and walked toward the professor. "If you don't mind, Dr. Oppenheimer, I would like to try," she said in a calm yet firm voice, with a slight accent that many couldn't identify. The professor hesitated for a moment, then handed her the chalk with a slight nod. The students could barely contain their laughter, anticipating what they considered to be a spectacle of ignorance. Day stood before the blackboard for a moment, studying the complex equation that Dr. Oppenheimer had written. The silence in the room was interrupted only by a few stifled laughs and the occasional whisper of mockery. She raised her trembling hand, hesitating briefly before touching the chalk to the board. Some students were already whispering about how long they should let her try before someone intervened to spare her complete embarrassment. James Walton crossed his arms with a satisfied smile, waiting for the elderly woman's inevitable failure. He leaned toward the colleague beside him. $50 says she can't even understand the symbols. Oppenheimer, for his part, observed with a neutral expression, but his eyes revealed genuine curiosity. Feynman, at the back of the room, adjusted himself in his chair, leaning forward with growing interest. Days began to write. Her first strokes were hesitant, the chalk sometimes escaping from her wrinkled fingers. One of the students let out a laugh, quickly silenced by a stern look from Oppenheimer. As days continued, something curious began to happen. Her movements, initially slow and uncertain, gained fluidity. The equations began to flow from her hand with unexpected elegance. Mathematical symbols danced across the board in a sequence that, to the trained eyes in the room, began to make sense in a surprising way. The laughter gradually ceased. The silence that settled was no longer one of expectation for humiliation, but of growing perplexity. The elderly woman wasn't just solving the equation, she was approaching it in a way that few there had considered. "She's using a modified Lorentz transformation," muttered a student to himself, the incredulity evident in his voice. Days continued, unperturbed, as if she were alone in the room, conversing intimately with the numbers and symbols that filled the board. At a certain point, she stopped, contemplated her work for a few seconds, then erased a small section and rewrote it differently. Feynman, who had approached to observe better, let out a slight whistle of admiration. "This is," began one of the students, but his voice failed when Dace moved to a second column of the board and began to develop what appeared to be a completely new approach to the problem. The room was now in complete silence. All eyes were fixed on the elderly woman's movements, who worked with absolute concentration. There was no longer any trace of hesitation in her hands. Each symbol was written with precision and purpose. James Walton had lost his arrogant smile. His face was pale and his eyes scanned the equations on the board, trying to follow the reasoning that was developing before him. Oppenheimer had sat down, observing with an expression that mixed fascination and a vague recognition, as if trying to remember something important that was on the tip of his tongue. Days worked methodically, occasionally mumbling to herself in a language that sounded like German. When she reached the end of the second column, she stopped, contemplated the board for a moment, then returned to the beginning and made a small correction. It was at this moment that Dr. Oppenheimer rose abruptly. His eyes widened with sudden recognition. "Mein Gott," he murmured, using the German expression involuntarily. Dace turned to him with a small smile, the first she had shown since entering the room. "It's almost ready, Robert," she said with familiarity before returning to the board to complete her demonstration. The students exchanged confused looks. Robert. Had she called Dr. Oppenheimer by his first name? Feynman also seemed to have noticed something, as his eyes went from the elderly woman to the board and back, with an expression of growing understanding and amazement. Days finalized her solution with an elegant flourish of the chalk, placing it carefully on the professor's desk. What was on the board wasn't just the solution to the proposed problem, but an elegant reformulation that connected it to other concepts in a way that few physicists of that time would be capable of visualizing. "Gentlemen," said Oppenheimer, his voice slightly trembling with emotion, "I have the honor of introducing you to Dr. Elsa Einstein." A collective murmur of shock ran through the room. "Einstein?" repeated James Walton, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes, Mr. Walton," confirmed Oppenheimer. "This is Elsa Einstein, widow of Professor Albert Einstein and, herself, a notable theoretical physicist who collaborated with her husband on various works, although she rarely received the appropriate credit. Days, or rather, Elsa, inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement. Her eyes, behind the simple glasses, shone with a mixture of wisdom and a touch of amusement at the evident shock of the young students. "Professor Einstein always said that I had a special intuition for field transformations," she said modestly, her German accent now more pronounced. Although, of course, he was much quicker with calculation. The stunned silence was broken by Feynman, who approached with reverence. "Dr. Einstein, it is an immense honor. Your husband told me about your contributions to his work on general relativity during a conference in Princeton, shortly before his death. He specifically mentioned your insight on invariant transformations." Elsa smiled gently. Albert was too generous with his praises. "Our discussions were just part of his creative process." "With all due respect, Dr. Einstein," intervened Oppenheimer, "Professor Einstein himself once confided in me that it was your perspective on the Kaluza-Klein problem that helped him reformulate his approach in his later years." The students remained silent, absorbing the magnitude of the moment. There before them was not only the widow of the greatest physicist of the century, but a scientist who had worked side by side with Einstein, silently contributing to some of the most revolutionary theories of modern physics. James Walton seemed to have shrunk in his chair, his face a mask of shame and regret. "Dr. Oppenheimer exaggerates my contribution," said Elsa, with humility. "But it is true that Albert and I often discussed his work. In our kitchen in Princeton, while I prepared tea, Albert would draw equations on napkins and ask me what I thought." She paused, her eyes momentarily lost in distant memories. "Albert always said that physics was like a cosmic puzzle, and that sometimes those who were not so deeply immersed in conventions could see patterns that escaped the specialists." The room was in complete silence now, each word from Elsa absorbed with reverence. "After Albert's death, I have occasionally visited lectures and classes. Not to teach, there are much more qualified professors for that, but to keep alive this connection to the world that so fascinated my husband." "Dr. Einstein," said James Walton, rising with visible effort, his voice trembling with emotion and shame, "I sincerely apologize for my deplorable behavior. My arrogance and prejudice are unforgivable." Elsa looked at the young man for a long moment, then smiled with kindness. "Mr. Walton, science teaches us to question our most basic assumptions. It is a lesson that applies not only to equations, but to life." She approached the student, who seemed diminished despite his physical stature. "Albert used to say that prejudice is harder to split than an atom. But you are young, and youth comes with the privilege of growth and change." The young man nodded, words failing him in the face of the magnanimity of the elderly woman he had tried to humiliate. "If you'll allow me," said Elsa, turning to the entire class, "I would like to share an observation that Albert made in his final days." The students leaned forward, eager to capture every word. "He said that the greatest equation he ever tried to solve was that of human compassion. As beings with minds capable of understanding the vastness of the cosmos, we often fail to understand the hearts of those beside us." She paused, her eyes scanning the young and now attentive faces. True genius, he believed, is not just in understanding the universe, but in using that knowledge to diminish suffering and increase understanding among people. Oppenheimer, who had worked on the Manhattan Project and carried the moral weight of that involvement, bowed his head in silent recognition of the profound truth in her words. At the end of the class, as the students dispersed in silent and contemplative groups, Oppenheimer approached Elsa. "It would be an immense honor if you would agree to conduct a series of special lectures here at Princeton," he said. "Your unique perspective would be invaluable to our students." Elsa seemed surprised by the invitation. "Robert, I am just an old lady who had the privilege of conversing with a great man about great ideas. There are much more qualified physicists." "Exactly why your voice is needed," insisted Oppenheimer. "Science needs diversity of thought, perspectives that challenge our presuppositions. What we witnessed today was not just mathematical brilliance, but a fundamentally different approach to a known problem." Feynman, who had joined them, added, "Besides, Dr. Einstein, your presence would be a powerful reminder that science belongs to all who have the courage to question and the perseverance to seek answers, regardless of age, gender, or origin." In the weeks that followed, Elsa Einstein's presence transformed the physics department at Princeton. Her lectures, initially received with curiosity, soon became the most sought after on campus, not just because of the connection with Albert Einstein, but for the clarity and depth with which she approached complex concepts. James Walton, the student who had tried to humiliate her, became one of her most dedicated students. The transformation in his attitude was evident to all, his previous arrogance replaced by genuine humility and thirst for knowledge. On a winter afternoon, as snow fell gently on the campus, Elsa found herself again in front of a blackboard, this time surrounded by attentive and respectful students. Among them was a young woman, the only one in a sea of male faces, who observed with intense interest. At the end of the lecture, this young woman approached timidly. "Dr. Einstein, your lectures have inspired me to continue in the physics program, despite everyone telling me it's not a place for women," she said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. Elsa smiled and placed a gentle hand on the young woman's shoulder. "The universe doesn't care who unravels its secrets, my dear. Only with the truth of the equations. And the most important equation you should always remember is this: your value is not determined by how others see you, but by the courage with which you pursue the truth." As she walked down the marble corridor of the university that had once welcomed her husband, Elsa Einstein reflected on life's ironies. As a woman whose own contribution to science had been obscured by her husband's genius, she now found her own voice, not just as the guardian of Albert's legacy, but as a mentor in her own right. The Einstein's legacy continued, not just in the equations inscribed on blackboards or printed in physics books, but in the subtle and profound transformation of the minds they touched, a human equation whose result was greater than the sum of its parts. If you've come this far and this story has touched your heart, I invite you to keep this faith alive with us by subscribing to the channel and activating the notification bell so you don't miss any stories that touch the soul. And if this story has moved you, give it a like so we can continue sharing more stories like this one, made with all our hearts. Until next time.